There is a bit of a break in the monsoon here in Mumbai, but there is no break in the winds, so I'm still hoping the sound will not get affected. This is a podcast on the physical and mental health impacts of heat waves. Obviously, heat waves, there is the wind. Heat waves are having a field day in terms of their duration, frequency, and intensity. And this is a map that NASA put together, especially Joshua Stevens. I think he's from NASA Goddard, GSFC, or maybe he's at JPL. But either way, surface air temperatures across the planet on July 13th, 2022 range from less than 0 degrees Celsius in many places, which is not unheard of, and to greater than 45 degrees Celsius in these places. Again, this is the desert, but very, very unusual for parts of Europe and parts of Central Eastern Asia. Middle East is desert, warm, but these were unusual still, and especially for parts of Pakistan, Afghanistan, into India. So the extent all the way down into peninsular India, the duration and the intensity was a combination of jet stream wiggling around and creating these kind of situations, plus La Nina contributing to the pattern here a little bit, and so on and so forth. The question is, does this have the same impact over here, let's say, compared to Europe? Obviously, these people have not been used to such temperatures, so you can expect the morbidity and mortality and other mental effects, maybe suicides, visits to therapists and so on, will be very different here than here. And this is a bit of a debate, because the number of mortalities reported in Pakistan and India were in the order of 100 or less, and some people obviously immediately claim that this number was manipulated by the government, but still you cannot manipulate from thousands to less than 100, I suspect. So there is the adaptation, which is genetic, and then there is adaptability, which is a epigenetic response to heat waves. So obviously you can expect that people in the tropics are used to responding to these. But there is a review study, a meta study of various published articles on the impact of high temperatures and heat waves on mortality, morbidity, and so on. So we are looking here, jumping right into this paper, studies associated with high ambient temperature and mental health related mortality. This is high ambient temperature and mental health related morbidity, and you can see the various studies focused on, so this is the percentage of studies focusing on various aspects. So exposure assessment, outcome assessment, confounding factors, selection, recruitment, incomplete data, selective reporting, conflict of interest, and other sources of bias were all considered to synthesize the results, to extract as confidently, robustly as possible the impact of high temperatures and heat waves on people's mental health. So these are studies associated with heat waves and mental health related mortality. So these were high ambient temperatures here, and these are by definition of criteria being met as classified to be heat waves, so this is not always necessarily the same. Nonetheless, studies associated with heat waves and mental health related morbidity is also shown. Sampling numbers are shown here in terms of publications considered. So these are again the same kind of bins of classifying the publications into various categories. So green color is low, probably low for yellow color, probably high and high. So reddish and dark red colors here. This is just a synthesis of the risk of bias assessment across studies in review, including high ambient temperature and mental health related mortality, high ambient temperatures and mental health related morbidity, heat waves and mental health related mortality, heat waves and mental health related morbidity. The traffic light plots were created using risk of bias visualization tool, which is the Robvis tool. So I'll just run through the tables without going into tremendous details about the statistical confidence intervals and p-values and so on and so forth, heterogeneity, etc. But we can just look at the various attributes. Random effects meta-analysis on the relationship between high temperatures and mental health morbidity and mortality outcomes in different groups. So this is overall cause-specific mental and behavioral disorders, which included schizophrenia, organic mental disorders, substance-related mental disorders. So these are kind of genetic or epigenetic, phenotypic, whatever you want to call. Substance-related mental disorders are associated with alcoholism, drugs, and maybe even overeating and so on. Mood disorders, neurotic and anxiety disorders, and other non-specified mental outcomes, and suicides and self-harm. Also separated into gender, and we have to be careful these days. We don't think of gender as binary. Age groups, always critical. Climate zones, obviously always critical for the impacts being very different. So tropical, dry, Mediterranean, oceanic, subtropical, continental, and income levels matter because the vulnerability is very much dependent on income level. If a heat wave comes, rich people may just sit home and turn on the AC or ride around in cars that have very good AC, whereas people with low income may not have AC and may be forced to travel with public transportation and forced to travel at all because they cannot afford to sit at home because their income on a daily basis may depend on working every day. So sex differences in mortality only included cause of suicides. Established number of specific risk estimates are shown here as well. So again, not going into numbers, that the paper concludes that there is robust evidence for these impacts. And the other interesting thing, again, looking at the impact of temperature exceedances in low latitudes versus mid latitudes and high latitudes, looking at minimum mortality temperature. These are the latitudes here. So you can see there is a negative correlation. So in the tropics, minimum mortality temperature is higher. At high latitudes, minimum mortality temperature is lower. This must be considered when talking about impacts of heat waves in places like Pakistan and India and Bangladesh, Nepal, tropical countries versus mid-latitude countries, because as soon as this excessive heat wave happened early in the season, March, April, compared to usual timing of May, June, July, and BBC had interviewed few scientists asking whether this region is becoming uninhabitable, and some scientists are always eager to oblige and say yes, 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 this is becoming dangerous. Yes, there are lots of impacts, but we must consider the fact that people in these regions are used to having warm temperatures. Old people will still die, mortality and morbidity will still go up, but jumping to saying it will become uninhabitable may be a bit of a stretch and not scientifically that robust. Okay, so minimum mortality temperature fitted values, mental health related minimum mortality temperature against latitude, star values derived from studies using mental health related minimum mortality temperature as threshold reference. All studies were conducted in the northern hemisphere, so there is also the hemispheric bias in the data itself. Okay, I should have another table here. Excuse me for a second. Sorry, this is a critical table that I should show. It basically summarizes the findings and strength of evidence in studies investigating the association between heat exposure, that is high temperatures and heat waves, and mental health related outcomes, mortality and morbidity for each exposure outcome pair. I won't again go into the details, but you can see how well the analysis, how detailed and careful the analysis is. So exposure outcome pairs here: direction of effect estimate, confidence in effect estimate, which is very critical for scientific robustness. So when people say Asia will become uninhabitable, they are skipping this step and just guessing at best. Other compelling aspects: overall strength of evidence, quality of evidence, moderate, so high temperature mortalities, MBDs, suicides, morbidities, heat wave mortality and morbidity. So high temperature and heat wave are separated just so that the studies that focused on temperature anomalies versus defined heat waves, they are not necessarily the same, as I said. Okay, so direction of effect estimates consider things like MBDs related deaths increased with increasing exposure to high temperatures. Mortality due to suicides increased with increasing exposures to high temperatures. So MBDs, sorry, I should say MBDs are mental and behavioral disorders. Okay, so that should be said. Not always careful, I guess. MBD related mortality increased with increasing exposure to high temperatures. Confidence in effect estimate is expressed this way: no substantial changes were observed in sensitivity analysis, thus an effect estimate from a new study is less likely to shift the pooled effect estimate to null. So there is already a kind of a conclusion that is robust enough that it's not going to be altered by new findings. Other compelling aspects include things like variation in threshold temperatures, contextual factors, including population vulnerability and exposure level. Any intervention or preventative response vary across studies, may make interpretation less certain, as well as the residual confounding factors. So, it's incredible detail there. Nonetheless, overall strength of evidence is looked at as sufficient and limited. So for the heat wave, mortality and morbidity, both are listed as limited here. Whereas for high temperature mortality, morbidity, and mental and behavioral disorders are listed as sufficient. For example, we found that there is a positive association between high temperatures and MBDs related mortality. The available evidence includes results from large proportion of studies in well-designed and well-conducted. Therefore, we believe that our conclusion is less likely to be strongly affected by the results of future studies. Okay, so unlikely that new data is going to alter the basic conclusions in this case, and similarly for these as well. When evidence is limited, based on our analysis and interpretation of the evidence, we concluded that the increased risk of mental health related mortality during heat wave exposure is likely. However, evidence is limited because of the insufficient number of studies to facilitate comparisons across studies in different heat wave definitions. So definition itself will matter there as well. Even for morbidity, based on our analysis and interpretation of the evidence, we conclude that increased risk of mental health related morbidity during heat wave exposure is likely. However, evidence is limited because of the insufficient number of studies to facilitate comparison across studies in different heat wave definitions. So this is largely on behavioral and mental disorders, but the physical health impacts are also very well known. You cannot sleep as well. Increased risks of hay fever when combined with heat waves, increased risk of COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases when combined with pollution, for example, especially heat waves and ozone, or heat waves and PM 2.5. Sometimes heat waves and humidity can cause serious asthma, morbidities, and mortalities. So physical impacts are well known, and we have discussed it elsewhere. I also have it under my course on climate and health. So this is much more of a mental health, and I wanted to include it here as a supplement to the known heat wave impacts on physical health as well. Okay, so let me leave this here for now.